Well, good morning. This morning, I just wanted to share some ideas that have been bouncing around, and I just don't want them to get lost in the ether. So, this one was something I was bouncing around about a year ago in 2023. I was looking at um, the unconscious, Carl Jung, active imagination, Ching, and Nietzsche. All the things that I'm very passionate about. I've loved Nietzsche for my entire life. I've loved the Ching for my entire life, practically, since I was about 14. And the love of both led to a love of Carl Jung because he loved them both as I did. So, tapping into the unconscious, Carl Jung, active imagination, and the I Ching, and Nietzsche. Hello, welcome to another episode of the podcast where we'll explore deep philosophical and psychological insights, particularly those of Nietzsche, Jung, and other thinkers who have radically influenced how we understand ourselves and the world. Today's episode is going to dive into a fascinating blend of themes. Carl Jung's concept of active imagination, his use of the I Ching as a tool for accessing the unconscious, and how these ideas intersect with the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. We'll also explore some of my personal reflections and interpretations along the way. So, let's begin by discussing active imagination. Now, Carl Jung developed this method as a way to actively engage with the unconscious. It's almost like having a dialogue with the images, symbols, or scenarios that come to mind when we let go of our rational thinking. Unlike regular daydreaming or random thoughts, active imagination asks us to consciously observe and participate in these mental images. It's a bit like meditation or contemplation, but instead of quieting the mind, you let it speak and you listen deeply. Jung believed that the unconscious communicates in symbols, archetypes, images, and by interacting with these symbols, we could gain profound insight into our psyche. I kind of wrote that awkwardly, so I apologize. So Jung believed that the unconscious communicates in symbols, archetypes, and imagery. And as a separate sentence, I would say, by interacting with these symbols, we could gain profound insight into our own psyche. This could lead to healing, personal growth, or even creative breakthroughs. Think of it as a bridge between our conscious and unconscious selves. Now, a really interesting intersection of Jung's work comes with his use of the I Ching, also known as the Book of Changes. If you're not familiar, the I Ching, or the I Ching, is an ancient Chinese text used for divination. Jung saw it as a way to access the unconscious in a more structured format. Imagine you're trying to understand something that's been nagging at your unconscious mind. You have a sense that there's something beneath the surface, but you're not quite sure what. You ask the I Ching a question, and the resulting hexagrams, the symbolic patterns that emerge, speak back in a language that's symbolic and metaphorical. And let me just add a little insight here. So this is the book, the I Ching. This is the one I use. It's called The Complete I Ching by Master Huang, Alfred Huang. I love it because, unlike most other books, he will tell you what other translations are. He even gives you the original Oracle Bone scripts because you can learn a lot from the character itself. And he talks about the hexagram. What's beautiful is there's so much information in detail that is so salient to our daily lives that what's happening is you're tapping into your own intuition because you're reading into the insights of the book are what allow you to tap into your own insights. So it's a wonderful practice. It really is. So this process works similar to active imagination. The symbolic messages that emerge from the I Ching aren't necessarily magical answers, but rather reflections of what's happening in the unconscious. Jung saw it as a tool for synchronicity, right? Synchronicity to Jung is seeing a causal connection that resonates for you, that matters for you, but there is no causal connection. You see it in a causal connection, but it has meaning for you, synchronicity. So, synchronicity, that meaningful coincidence between internal psychological states and external events. You might not think of it as merely random chance that the symbols seem to speak to you directly. It's more like the unconscious is using this ancient tool to make its voice heard. Not that different from dreams, but what Jung, I believe, loved about active imagination is it allowed you to um, to engage directly with your unconscious, in a sense. So, so why is this relevant to Friedrich Nietzsche? Nietzsche, particularly in his "Thus Spoke Zarathustra," often wrote about the complexities of the self, the conflicts between different aspects of the human soul, and the struggle for meaning. In many ways, Nietzsche prefigures Jung's explorations of the unconscious, though he never explicitly used Jungian language. Jung himself recognized this. He was deeply influenced by Nietzsche's work, especially the concept of the will to power and the eternal return, the shadow, Gestalt, right, the complex of identity, meaning, Schätzen. Yeah, in Jung's Red Book, he is very clear about the profound influence that Nietzsche's work had on him. So, one of the ways Jung diverged from Nietzsche, though, is in his view of healing. While Nietzsche might speak about transcending suffering and embracing one's fate, Jung's work, through tools like active imagination and the Ching, give us practical ways to integrate and understand our inner conflicts. For Nietzsche, the struggle for meaning often had an existential tragic quality. For Jung, there's a path forward, a path that involves engaging directly with the unconscious and reconciling those inner tensions. As Virgil said to Dante in the Inferno, when Dante asked, "How do we get out of this place we're trapped in?" He double hockey sticks. Virgil said, "The way out is through." And that's exactly what Jung was trying to teach us. And so was Nietzsche, but we'll continue. I find it fascinating how these two thinkers, Nietzsche and Jung, represent different sides of a similar coin. Nietzsche invites us to confront the raw realities of existence, to embrace the chaos, and to make meaning despite or because of it. Jung, on the other hand, gives us tools to actively engage with the chaos, to listen to the unconscious and work with it. They both recognize that meaning doesn't just arrive, it has to be discovered, created, engaged with, schätzen, often through a dance between the conscious and the unconscious mind. Yes, we are the arbiters of value, of creation, of meaning. We are the ones that decide what matters. Well, and this brings me back to what we were discussing earlier, the I Ching as a tool for divination and active imagination. And don't misunderstand divination. Think of it like how the my favorite one of my favorite English TV shows called Lovejoy. He was and what he was called was a divvy. He was considered to be able to see into the history of antique furniture and historic items. I found that quite funny. So this idea in English, a divvy is someone who is like a psychic in a sense, right? So divination is not so much psychic. See it as seeing all of the information that's available and integrating it, right? So imagine using the I Ching in the midst of a personal crisis or when you're feeling stuck in life. Through symbols, you get a reflection of your unconscious mind, just as active imagination brings those deep-seated images into focus. Both methods allow you to engage with the unknown aspects of your psyche. Remember, psyche just can be soul, but it literally just means yourself, your identity, your consciousness. In Buddhism, we would call it your chitta, or the alaya vijnana, your storehouse of preferences, is how I would translate it. It's not a storehouse of self. It's a storehouse of your favorite color, your least favorite person, your favorite teacher. I mean, all of these different preferences all come together into what Nietzsche called Gestalt. It is the identity, but it's a complex of innumerable ones. In fact, the example Nietzsche gave is he was half Polish, half German. And he said anytime he ran into a German, they assumed him German. He ran into a Pole, they assumed him Pole. And I guess the opposite could be true as well, that a Pole could see him as not Pole enough, and vice versa. When in reality, he said, I am neither. I'm something more. I've talked about this, that the Canadian identity is very similar to that. We don't define who and what we are individually the way you would think. We actually do it very similar to Carl Jung's active imagination in the individuation process. It's by figuring out what we're not that we find out who we are. It's my own cliche, I say it all the time, that we should try to embody our idols. And in the failure to do so, in the failure of actually cloning our idols, where we end up landing is truly who we are. That's yourself, your true self, your individuation, your integration of who you are and who you're not. But anyways, I digress. I apologize. So both methods allow you to engage with the unknown aspects of the psyche, helping you make sense of the internal conflicts that Nietzsche often spoke about, the tension between who you are and who you want to become. And as I said, it can even go to W.E.B. Du Bois, where he said, when people treat you as something other than what you are, it can cause what he called a double consciousness, right? You look in the mirror, you see one person, one identity. And when you go into the world and people treat you differently, that can cause a schism, a break, a bifurcation of identity, a trauma, if you will, something that we should maybe consider healing. But that's something I'm working on as well. A true meta modern perspective of what trauma is, realizing that Buddhism is a treatment for trauma. Nietzsche was writing as a treatment for trauma. Even Carl Jung explained that he began his workbooks, his black books, that eventually led to his philosophy and his therapy, and eventually to his red book, his Liber Novus, right? Liber Novus, his new book, his first book, however you want to see it. It all began because of the trauma that was the First World War, and how it affected everyone and how it affected him, right? So next. As we close today's episode, I encourage you to reflect on these intersections, Jung's active imagination, the symbolism of the I Ching, and Nietzsche's philosophy. And I'll go one step further. And like I was talking to a neighbor there this morning, as Max Mueller said, if you only know of one religion, you have none at all. And I go one step further. If you only know of one philosophy, you have none at all. In fact, he was talking about he was going to a place local here called the School of Philosophy. I think it was just a bunch of edgelords getting together, wanting to be teachers of philosophy and discuss it. But he said they had a lot of know-it-alls that made it really kind of annoying. And I pointed out that it's not uncommon in philosophy that you'll find people that only know one specific area, right? A lot of people would think because I love Nietzsche and Zen Buddhism, say that I would be drawn to existentialism. But I think I've said this before, that I think it's a misunderstanding of Nietzsche's philosophy. Same as when I used to give tours in a Buddhist museum. I used to explain how there's important aspects of Buddhism that you need to understand, but it's often not well taught. The example would be impermanence of all things. And everyone sees impermanence as a negative. It's like, oh, I'm not going to live forever and happiness doesn't last. But it always shocked me because when I initially read Nietzsche, as with Buddhism, impermanence, especially for somebody who had a traumatic upbringing or what have you, impermanence was a wonderful thing to think about, a wonderful gift. Because, sure, a lot of people will complain about how, the good won't last. But shouldn't that teach you to appreciate it while it's here? And the same can be said about the bad. For me, impermanence resonated because it meant that the suffering or the trauma that someone might go through will not last. Right? just like the Chinese Book of Change. Here's a philosophy that you can actually take away from the book, not from your intuition. It's this idea that we're all trying to move towards fullness, as the Ching would say. In the Bible, they would call that wholeness, right? Individuation, completeness. In the process of trying to get to that, think of it as more of a blossoming, a shedding, and an addition, all at the same time. But the I Ching speaks to you never want to reach fullness, complete fullness, because that means it's going to reverse the cycle. The cycle is going to start over. So if you reach absolute fullness, then it's going to go back to the start. And so the same lesson goes a little bit deeper in the I Ching, and this idea that you do want to strive towards fullness, but only to a certain degree. And I think it's teaching the hubris that so many people suffer from, that you may achieve a certain level of expertise, but if you think yourself the greatest, well, then you're going to miss lessons along the way. And as I said, the positive aspect of impermanence is the same with the Chinese Book of Change. If you're stuck in a dark place, then this reversal, this vacillation between states means that you're only temporarily stuck in this negative position. That because of how everything's in flux, transforming, right? The Buddhist idea of becoming, very similar to Nietzsche, this idea that everything is either coming into existence or disappearing. And for me, that was always a very positive lesson. And what I found surprising is the hardest people, or the people that had the hardest time understanding this message, were the people that had the most, right? The people that seemed the wealthiest, or seemed to be ostentatious in the way they dressed, in the way they acted, in the way they spoke, in the way they carried themselves. They seemed to be the ones that had the most difficult of times to understand this idea. Whereas regular, everyday people, plain people, maybe even just run-of-the-mill people, didn't seem to have trouble understanding this, because, as I've said this before, and Nietzsche speaks to this, whatever doesn't kill you serves to make you stronger. And this is, when I talk about David Goggins, I think his idea of we're either growing or we're atrophying is the same idea. It's the same lesson. Nothing lost in the 150 years, right? But as I said, as we close today's episode, I encourage you to reflect on these intersections. And I'd even encourage you to read some Jung, some Nietzsche, and even get yourself a copy of the I Ching, or even engage with it online. Right? And you can try Jung's active imagination. You can look into the symbolism of the I Ching, and you can experience Nietzsche's philosophy. What do they reveal about the human condition? More so, what does it reveal to you about you? And about our struggles for meaning. Can it reveal to you, is your struggle for meaning, and what is meaning for you? And maybe it can teach you the lesson that you are the arbiter of meaning, right? And about how we confront and integrate the unconscious. I believe there's a rich conversation to be had here, and I hope this episode sparks some of that curiosity in you. But yeah, so on that note, thank you for listening. Be sure to tune in next time. Give me a subscribe. Usually I say leave a review, but I don't think you do reviews. So leave a comment here on the YouTubes. So any questions or anything we'd like to dive into? Otherwise, join us next time as we dive deeper into these complex but rewarding explorations of the psyche, philosophy, and the search for meaning. And I posit maybe a cure for the modern malaise, the meaning crisis, this ennui we all seem to suffer. Thank you. I'm out.